My name is Damon. I'm a reporter with the World Socialist Web Site. I'm here with my colleague Andrea Peters, and we're going to be speaking to David North about his recently published book, The Russian Revolution and the Unfinished 20th Century. So first, to start off, we'd like to welcome David. Thank you very much for being here, and we're very glad to have you.
I'm glad to be here.
Also, we'd like to welcome our listeners from all over the world. Just looking at our statistics, we've got people from a number of continents who are listening to this stream, and we're very glad that you could participate in this event. Just a few notes to start out. We will be accepting questions from our readers. Please feel free to submit your questions on the page in which you see the stream, and we can have them answered by David. David North is the chairman of the International Editorial Board of the World Socialist Web Site and the national chairman of the Socialist Equality Party in the U.S. He's a prolific author and lecturer, and his published works include The Heritage We Defend, The Crisis of American Democracy, Marxism, History and Socialist Consciousness, and In Defense of Leon Trotsky. All of them are available on Mehring.com. Through Sunday, Mehring Books is selling The Russian Revolution and the Unfinished 20th Century for a special price of $17.95, and the ebook is available for only $7.99. This is a significant discount, and we would encourage everyone to take a look at it. You can access Mehring Books through the link on the page in which you're viewing this stream. Andrea?
David, this book consists of lectures and essays, really materials developed over the course of 20 years. It covers a broad range of topics, from the nature of the 1917 Russian Revolution, to the character of American liberalism, to the causes of World War II, to questions of Marxist philosophy and theory. And yet it also has a remarkable degree of coherence, I would say continuity, really encapsulated in the concept of the unfinished 20th century. Can you briefly explain for our listeners what you mean by the unfinished 20th century, and also speak about when this idea, this way of understanding the last 100 years, first became clear to you?
Well, the concept of the unfinished 20th century really means that the political problems with which we're confronted today within the United States and internationally are essentially problems which are rooted in the unsolved contradictions of world capitalism, the undecided battles of the class struggle as they raged in the course of the 20th century. This year, 2014, this year, 2014, is the 100th anniversary of the outbreak of World War I. Many have noted the extraordinary connection between the present crisis, in which the threat of war has been raised seriously, the possibility of a nuclear confrontation between the United States and Russia, even between the United States and China. This comes exactly 100 years after the outbreak of World War I. And so many of the underlying issues resonate historically. So when one examines these events, one is compelled to do so in a historical context, and the only way they can be understood is by tracing the roots of these crises to the problems of the 20th century. Now, beyond the contemporary headlines, there's a broader significance, and the way in which this concept arose, and I'd say the book itself, is all these lectures were written or delivered in the aftermath of the dissolution of the Soviet Union in 1991. And at that time, the end of the USSR was proclaimed to be not just the end of the Soviet Union as a particular state, a geopolitical entity, but really the end of any possibility of a challenge to capitalism. And that to the extent that the 20th century had seen the struggle between capitalism and socialism, the end of the USSR resolved that issue. It was settled. Socialism had been defeated. Capitalism had won. That was the basic thesis of bourgeois triumphalism in the immediate aftermath of the dissolution of the USSR, and it probably found its most pristine expression in the declaration of Fukuyama of the end of history, which was his way of saying that whatever conflicts and struggles may arise in the future, there really is no path beyond capitalism, beyond bourgeois democracy. But there was another form of triumphalism, and that really was the position advanced somewhat later in the 1990s by Eric Hobsbawm, the well-known British historian who himself had been a long-time member for more than a half century of the British Communist Party, and he took the position that the period between 1914 and 1991 comprised the short 20th century, a 77-year period of wars, revolutions, but 1991 brought that to an end. In particular, as far as he was concerned, the period between 1917 and 1991, the 74 years of the existence of the USSR, was a unique, unrepeatable episode in history. As far as he was concerned, essentially a mistake, an aberration, the product of absolutely peculiar conditions, never again to be duplicated or repeated. The Russian Revolution was an aberration. It was all over. And whatever happened in the future, however grim it may be, certainly socialism wasn't the answer. Now, there was a very fundamental connection between that concept which he put forward and his own allegiance to Stalinism. He had, for Hobsbawm, as for not just Stalinists, but for so many liberals, the Soviet Union and Marxism were one and the same. No distinction was to be made. This was based largely on an ignoring of and direct hostility to the struggle against Stalinism that had been waged by the Trotskyist movement. But there was, you might say, a logic underlying Hobsbawm's position. He approached the question of the 20th century from the standpoint of this false identification of Stalinism and socialism. Now, for the Trotskyist movement, for the International Committee, which is rooted in the history of the Trotskyist movement, going back to not just the founding of the Fourth International in 1938, but the initiation of the opposition to Stalinism that began in 1923. The Trotskyist movement historically had rejected entirely this identification of Stalinism with Marxism, or the claim that so-called real existing socialism, as it was claimed to exist either in the Soviet Union or in the Eastern European states, that these Stalinist regimes in fact represented socialism. The Trotskyist movement had warned from the 1930s on that unless the Soviet bureaucracy was overthrown in a political revolution, capitalism would be restored. So the question of 1991 was not a question of the end of socialism. It was certainly a tremendous setback for the working class, a defeat which would have immense political and social implications, but it did not represent by any means the refutation of Marxism. Actually, quite the opposite was the case. However tragic this event, the analysis which the Trotskyist movement had made, the basic programmatic conception, which in a certain sense justified the founding of the Fourth International, have been vindicated. Stalinism, as Trotsky had warned, had led to the destruction of what had been the first worker state produced by the 1917 revolution. It was, so to speak, a vindication of the Marxist method and the Marxist perspective in the negative. So it was, in a certain sense, when Hobsbawm put forward the conception of the short 20th century, gradually in the course of a whole series of polemical responses to this conception and others which were related to it, the argument was made that really the 20th century is best understood as an unfinished century, the great political, social, even cultural issues, artistic issues posed in the 20th century have not been settled. the end of the USSR does not settle the question of socialism. Indeed, in a complex way, and I think this has also been vindicated, as we perhaps can come to somewhat later on in this discussion, from 1991 on, we see a continuous deepening intensification of the crisis of world capitalism. There is a crisis of the workers' movement internationally. There's the crisis of leadership, which is the greatest of all the unresolved questions of the 20th century. But the crisis of capitalism continues, deepens day by day.
Now, David, you place in this book an enormous amount of emphasis on the significance of the understanding of history, that history has lessons to draw for contemporary politics, and in particular, the assessment of the Soviet Union, what it was, what was its dissolution, and you take a very polemical approach to these problems. That you see these not as in any way sterile or futile academic debates, but life and death issues for contemporary politics. Could you speak of that approach to history a bit?
Well, I think the polemic, and I don't object when I'm described as a polemicist. Trotsky once said that the polemic flows from the nature of our epoch, a period of conflict. I think he once wrote that a revolution is a polemic that has taken up arms. The polemic reflects the struggle of real forces in society. And in the aftermath of the dissolution of the USSR, the conflict over historical issues assumed really an incredibly intense character. The writing of history, perhaps this is always true, but certainly to an extreme level, the writing of history acquired an intensely political character. It is difficult to discuss any historical question without finding oneself embroiled in political debate, or to discuss a political issue without being compelled to examine its historical roots. So, in a certain sense, you could say, tell me what your politics are, and I'll tell you what your attitude to history is. And even today, if we look at an event, and this is one of the issues covered toward the end of the book, the issue of the Ukraine, how can one discuss this event without examining the origins of the Ukraine, the complex questions related to the formation of the Soviet Union, the experience of the Second World War? Many of the actors remain the same politically. So, yes, it's true. This book places immense stress on historical consciousness. I would go so far as to say that that genuine class consciousness has an intensely historical character. A political party of the working class, a revolutionary party, is itself an organization that carries with it the history of the workers' movement. History is not simply forgotten. We live in a time where we're constantly being told to move on, to forget everything. Just in the last week, the American government, its crimes are exposed before the entire world, and its response is move on. Let's just forget about it. Let's not be troubled by the crimes that were committed. Well, something of the same attitude exists among large layers of the petty bourgeois or ex-petty bourgeois left, which shows generally a complete disinterest in history or adopts toward historical questions an utterly pragmatic and subjective attitude. So this book, yes, does work through historical questions, but I hope it does it in a way which establishes the connection at every point between history and the great problems which we confront today. The question of history, as I've just indicated, the question of history is itself the subject of intense controversy. After all, one of the major subjects dealt with in the book is the attitude toward history by postmodernists who entirely reject the conception of objective history, who insist on the most extreme subjectivism, and even, in certain formulations, claim that history is nothing more than an invention, a fabrication, created for the convenience of one or another interest. And there's nothing that historical events do not reference real, or history does not reference real events whose objective content can be determined.
Yes, well, I think this discussion transitions logically into, I think, another major theme in the book, and that is historical falsification. The attempt to, by historians acting in the interests of various national ruling classes, to rewrite the history of the 20th century. Recently, our organization, the PSG in Germany, was attacked in a editorial in the Frankfurter Allgemeine, in which it accused us of, in our campaign against historical falsification of Humboldt University, of seeking to somehow intimidate academic freedom. And could you perhaps respond to this accusation by the FAZ?
Well, let me just take the more general question, and you're referring, of course, to the issues which have arisen relating to World War II. Again, to illustrate the question of the unfinished 20th century, who would have thought, and I'm saying that somewhat rhetorically, but who would have thought that the question of the criminality of the Nazis and of the Hitler regime would be called into question? As a matter of fact, there was a major debate in 1985, 1986. It was called the Historischer Streit, the struggle among historians, in which one historian, Ernst Nolte, who had sought to relativize, more precisely adopt an apologetic, justifying attitude to the crimes of Hitler. He had come under ferocious attack and was largely discredited. In the last year or so, one has seen an astonishing revival of Nolte's reputation. He is being publicly defended, virtually without challenge, in the German media. And that is related to political changes in Germany itself, where during the past year there has been an effort at the highest levels of the state, beginning with speeches made by the president of Germany, Gauck, by leading academics, media people, and so on, claiming that Germany must adopt a more aggressive geopolitical stance. The foreign minister of Germany just made a speech in which he declared that the task of Germany is to lead Europe so it can lead the world. Now, if there isn't something that resonates with the experience of the 20th century. Now, that shifting geopolitical agenda, which is extremely ominous, and of course very much related both to the crisis in Ukraine and the confrontation with Russia, that finds its historical expression in efforts not both to revise the historical understanding of the nature of the Third Reich, but also, for example, to revise the understanding of Germany's not exclusive but central responsibility for the outbreak of war in 1914. So these historical issues come together. And yes, our party in Germany has been leading a struggle against this effort at historical relativization, historical apologetics, to somehow revive and legitimize and justify the crimes of fascism in the service of imperialist objectives of the German state and the German ruling elite.
We are speaking here today with David North, the author of The Unfinished 20th Century, live from Detroit. David, we have some questions coming in from our listeners, and I'd like to pose a question to you by Chris from Manchester. Chris asks, what would you say is the most hopeful message to come from your analysis of the Russian Revolution and the subsequent unfolding of the rest of the 20th century? And I'm glad that Chris asked this question because you make a point in the foreword. You say, for Marxists, the existential category of hopelessness has no place in a scientific appraisal of historical possibilities. So can you explain for us what the foundations of hopefulness are from a Marxist perspective?
Well, hopefully this has nothing to do with a Pollyannish approach, which says that all things will work out in the end. We're realists, and we understand that the situation is extremely dangerous. The risks of war are very great, and there's no law, and it certainly has nothing to do with historical determinism and Marxism, to believe that the future is somehow vouchsafed. But we do have a historical optimism, which is based on the possibility that man, first of all, can comprehend and master the forces which presently dominate his existence. The ability to make an analysis of the past, to understand the historical process through which one is passing, is itself a conquest of scientific thought, and makes possible conscious human intervention in this unfolding process in a manner which enables those objectively progressive tendencies in the historical situation. The working class, the enormous development of the productive forces to acquire, to master the situation. So understanding history, understanding the historical experience is itself an enormously powerful weapon in the struggle for man's liberation. That's precisely why history is under such attack, or an objective approach to history, why historical materialism is despised by so many different schools of petty bourgeois, ex-left thought. That as we know, it's really striking. And I refer to this fact many times. How much animus is directed against Engels, the effort to separate the Marx, who developed with Engels historical materialism, from the pre-Marxian schools of idealism, that is, to present Marx really essentially as an idealist German philosopher, Engels as the corrupt materialist, so-called positivist, who falsely infected Marxism with an unwanted and false and destructive emphasis on scientific knowledge.
You're speaking a lot today about the question of history. I think in your remarks you mentioned that one can really judge one's politics on the basis of how one views history. And this allows me to raise a theoretical question for you. Your book takes up the question of postmodernism, which you describe as, quote unquote, a flight from historical truth and an attack on science. But in academia, postmodernism is often presented as a sort of leftist theory, a continuation of radical thought. So can you explain how postmodernism's essential premises are at odds with Marxism, particularly as it relates to this issue of historical truth?
You don't expect me to do that in 5 minutes, do you?
I'm hoping you will.
Let me just take certain elements of that question. First of all, I think one thing one must understand about postmodernism and its various schools, and whether one's speaking of those such as Lyotard or Foucault or the States Rorty, much of what is known generally as postmodernism emerged quite directly in opposition to Marxism. If one were to trace its development, its connection to previous schools of existential thought, and even beyond that, the forms of idealism which acquired a tremendous following in middle-class academic layers as early as the 1890s. The emphasis on subjectivism, voluntarism, the rejection of science, the claim that Marxism lacked a psychology. I came across an article written by all people by Louis Freina in 1918 who made such arguments. But really, they're not really very unusual. The German left movements which stood outside the social democracy, elements such as tragic figure, but Kurt Landauer, the anarchists of the 1890s. I mean, all these different types of subjective tendencies are to be found in postmodernism, but in particular, the figures who played such a central role in the development of postmodernism, the repudiation of a scientific approach to history, the very possibility of objective truth. It is striking that in one form or another, all of these central figures, in one way or another, began their intellectual careers either in the Communist Party or in some cases in movements which had had some sort of association with Trotskyism. And they represented a middle-class reaction against Marxism. And it was one which, of course, benefited from the fact that, particularly in the aftermath of the Second World War, the bureaucracies predominated, the revolutionary tendencies were very weak. The classical Marxism, which Trotsky and Lenin had represented, had suffered devastating defeats. Much of its cadre had been annihilated, both within the Soviet Union and, of course, within Europe, either by the Stalinists or by the fascists. And so they represented a philosophical reaction. And we see, particularly in the aftermath of 1968, as these tendencies more and more separated themselves from the working class, the overt hostility to Marxism becomes much more clear and directed. I mean, after all, if one considers the question of Lyotard's famous formulation of the end of grand narrative, what was the grand narratives he was opposed to? It was the narratives of essentially Trotsky's narrative of the October Revolution in the Russian Revolution, history of the Russian Revolution, and his explanation of Stalinism in The Revolution Betrayed. That was the narrative that was being repudiated. Along with that came the denunciation of the so-called privileged position invested by Marxism in the working class. The denial that there existed any coherent, law-governed development of history, that there was no central agency of historical development. I'm using some of their own academic language, but all of this was really directed against Marxism. And so it's inevitable in any discussion of the 20th century and of the intellectual tendencies which predominated, one has to deal with postmodernism. It also must be said that this came to a head with the dissolution of the USSR. By that point, I think it's striking. Postmodernist thinkers largely dispense with any even, they become much more frank and much more open in their hostility to the working class, to the perspective of socialist revolution. So, of course, a great deal of, it's almost inevitable that in a book of this character, which deals not just with events, but with the conceptions which have dominated as the middle-class intelligentsia has ever moved ever more openly against revolution, and as ex-radicals in the course of their readjustment to a post-Soviet Union period took out all their resentments and frustrations on Marxism and the working class. And so that this issue obviously plays a very important role in the book.
Again, we're here with David North, author of The Russian Revolution and the Unfinished 20th Century. I'd like to remind our readers that the book is on sale on Mehring.com. You can go to the link on the page with the stream, and you can get it for a special price this weekend. I'd also like to appeal for donations. If you are enjoying this program and would like to see more programs like it on the World Socialist website, you can donate. There's a link on the page that's displaying the stream. I have a follow-up question for David, sort of the flip side of Andrea's question. In your essay in response to Eric Hobsbawm, you seek to delineate historical processes from purely natural ones. You say that in society there are no phenomena that are, quote, purely objective. What do you mean by that?
Well, all historical events involve people. Human beings are the actors in the historical drama. People act on the basis of their understanding, on their passions. But of course, one has to understand and identify the processes which motivate the broader and deeper historical and social processes that motivate human actions. But in the course of, just to get at the background of the question you raise, one of the essays or lectures in this book deals with Bernstein. Now, Bernstein came up, and I might, as a way of clarifying an earlier issue, how was this book written and where did the Unfinished 20th Century come from? In the aftermath of the dissolution of the USSR, there was a whole, various efforts were made, again by academics, largely to find some sort of alternative to Marxism. One of the conceptions advanced was that Edward Bernstein's reformism was the road not taken, that far from being a sort of just renegade from Marxism, it was actually Bernstein who presented the most developed critique, and should one look back to his teachings and his conceptions and utilize that as a new basis for some future socialist movement. So in response to that, I actually decided I would go back and start reviewing what Bernstein had written. And I think it was very worthwhile doing it, if only to see how profound such critiques as those made by Plekhanov, who attacked Bernstein particularly on the question of materialism and exposed the far-reaching ramifications of Bernstein's subjective idealism, but also the great political polemical writing of Rosa Luxemburg. But at any rate, one of the arguments made by Bernstein as he opposed the conception of scientific socialism, he argued that no political movement can claim an association with science. You cannot speak of a scientific socialism because socialism can never be a science. Socialism is a political movement. It involves human volition, and only those phenomena which are completely untouched, uncontaminated by human agency, presumably, the orbital trajectories of planets and such phenomena can be the subject of scientific examination. Social movements cannot be because they have human agency. This was a way by which Bernstein really wanted to convert socialism into a form of utopia. It was an ideal to be realized, but no one can claim that there existed objective tendencies which could be the subject of scientific study. So that was I felt obliged to answer that. Now, the point is, though, in the historical process, and this is what is, you might say, unique about the socialist movement, and the social revolution itself. Socialism as an objective possibility arises out of the contradictions of the capitalist system, out of the conflict between private property and the social character of production, between the global character of production and the persistence of the nation-state system, and the conflict over surplus value, and so on. But the objective tendencies which make socialism both possible and necessary cannot be realized spontaneously. It requires an insight into these, you might say, hidden objective laws. Marx points to this, I think, with great eloquence and with great profundity in the first volume of Capital, when he explains and demonstrates why the forms of appearance objectively generated by the process of capitalist production, that is, the nature of the commodity itself, the form of the commodity conceals the objective relationship, the objective social relationship that exists. And his famous passage that in capitalism, commodities are relations between people that assume the form of a relation between things. So the objective nature of capitalist exploitation is concealed. It cannot be identified simply through its surface appearance. There has to be a theoretically informed insight into the nature of capitalist property relations, the capitalist system of production, and so on. And so the task of the party is to develop that consciousness in the working class. That has to, without that, no matter how severe and intense the contradictions of capitalism are, the crisis cannot be resolved. But that is what is so specific or so historically significant or unique of the process which leads to socialist revolution. The objective possibility of socialism can only be realized through the conscious action of the working class. There must be a substantial section of the working class which strives deliberately to achieve socialism. The growth of the party is itself an expression, is the subjective form of that growing development of consciousness in the working class.
So I'd just like to direct readers' attention to the fact that some of the issues David was just speaking about can be found in Chapter 5 of Reform and Revolution in the Epoch of Imperialism, as well as the chapter on the origins of Bolshevism and what is to be done, Lenin's Theory of Socialist Consciousness. You can purchase a copy of David's book, The Unfinished 20th Century, on Mehring.com. David, I'd like to move again to a reader's question. We have Mark from Buffalo is asking, do you know any historians working faithfully as using a genuine Marxist approach? Although you are not a professional historian, your historical materialism allows you to understand the 20th century far better than a bourgeois historian. Are there other serious materialist historians today? Maybe you could speak perhaps a little bit about Vadim Rogovin, who you dedicated this work to, and I know you have tremendous respect for and had a big influence on your own understanding.
Well, I just want to make a point. I think there are many serious historians, and when you read my book, you'll see that I cite from many works by historians who do not happen to be Marxist. I don't think that it is only a Marxist historian that can do serious work. There are historians who are working in the archives. I have referred specifically to the work of Alexander Rabinovich at the University of Indiana, who has done really great work in revealing the historical processes or the actual conflicts and struggles of 1917 and their immediate aftermath. Historians such as Richard Day. One of the chapters deals with a book put out by Richard Day and Daniel Gato to substantial historians, and there are many others I refer to. So I, of course, in a book such as this, in a polemical work, one tends to be responding to those who engage in falsification, and unfortunately those works seem to gain much more attention, but certainly there are some very fine historians producing serious work, and I applaud them, and I know that many of them work on the most difficult circumstances, and I have the greatest respect for their efforts. Now, as far as Vadim Rogovin, yes, I have dedicated this book to his memory. I think Vadim will live in history as the greatest post-Soviet historian. He was actually a sociologist by profession, but he used his access to archives from the 1950s on to gather an enormous amount of information about the struggle of the left opposition, the Trotskyist movement. And in the period of Glasnost, he began to publish more directly on this work. I met Vadim in Kiev in February 1993. He had just completed a volume which was entitled, Was There an Alternative? And it was a study of the formation of the left opposition in 1923, a really quite wonderful work. We began what became a long series of discussions. By the time we met already, the Soviet Union had been dissolved, and the period of more open discussion had already come to an end. And once again, the ex-Stalinists, reconstructed capitalists, those who had been denouncing Trotsky as the enemy of the Soviet Union, made a seamless transition to denouncing Trotsky as the crazed apostle of world revolution and international socialism. And now we're engaged in a new series of falsifications of Trotsky's role, people such as Volkoganov and others. So we agreed that we would work together in what we called the post-Soviet, struggle against what we called the post-Soviet school of historical falsification. And we're able to collaborate very closely as Vadim, despite fatal illness, he was diagnosed with cancer in 1994. Vadim wrote another 6 volumes in which he traced the development of the struggle of Trotsky and the left opposition, then the Fourth International, from 1923 through to the assassination of Trotsky in 1940. The last volume in this series of works was dedicated to the International Committee of the Fourth International. So I thought it was appropriate that Vadim's immensely significant, really great work should be honored, and that's why the book is dedicated to him.
So at this point, we'd like to perhaps shift gears a little bit and put some of the conceptions presented in the book more in context of contemporary political developments. We're getting a number of questions coming in from our listeners on the relationship of the issues raised in the book and the attack on democracy. Of course, we're having this conversation in the context of first the wave of ongoing police killings throughout the United States, in New York and St. Louis and in Cleveland, and at the same time in the wake of the release of the really horrific report on the torture that was conducted at Guantanamo Bay, and throughout other sites throughout the world by the CIA. And a reader or a listener, Addie, asks about the relationship of democracy and democratic principles to kind of historical falsification and the issues raised in the book. And perhaps just to take off from that, and the basic thesis of the unfinished 20th century, and in many ways in response to Fukuyama, is that in fact, that there is an alternative. That the Fukuyama claimed that quote liberal democracy is, as he put it, is the best there is. And I think certainly that these most recent developments, saying that the world would continuously progress, towards liberal democracy and the kind of the equation of capitalism and democracy, I think are quite deeply flawed and would point to the correctness of the thesis. Could you perhaps speak about some of these issues?
Of course. Well, the Fukuyama thesis of the end of history and the triumph of bourgeois democracy, I mean, what has become very clear is that under capitalism, bourgeois democracy has no future whatsoever. We can have a bourgeoisie, but no democracy. Capitalism and its political institutions are rotting on its feet. I mean, let's be perfectly blunt. We have learned, it is now officially, publicly known, that the U.S. government has been run by criminals. The Bush administration was an administration of criminals, and its criminal activity has continued under the Obama administration. If the laws that were applied and the rules that were applied at Nuremberg in 1946 were in operation today, Bush, Cheney, Rumsfeld, to name just a few, would spend the rest of their lives behind bars, which is where they belong. But not only do we know that crimes have been committed and that that the Bush administration was a criminal government in the most precise sense of the term, and that criminal activities have continued under the Obama administration, and many of those who carried out criminal activities still hold positions of great power in the present administration. We also know that absolutely nothing will be done to bring these people to justice. That's been stated. It's already striking. Within about a day and a half or 2 days, these references to the report were already disappearing from the newspapers and from the evening news. So this is an extraordinary situation. There simply exists no mechanism within the existing political system to enforce the law. There is a fundamental break with democracy which is underway. I think the question which is posed now to great masses of working people is, well, what are they going to do about the fact that they are being ruled by criminals? And there is a very clear connection between the criminal activities of the United States beyond its borders and the lawlessness and violence practiced by the state authorities within the United States. The murders, police murders in Staten Island, in Cleveland, in Ferguson, this is bound up with the militarization of society. This is part of the war on terror. It is not possible to maintain a sort of Chinese wall separating one from the other. The same regime, the same state, the same class is carrying this out. They are violating the law internationally, and they're doing so within America. The police have been militarized. I think these connections are very, very important. So if we come back to the issue, I think it was what you raised earlier, about it isn't that we're talking about some abstract alternative. Was Fukuyama correct that bourgeois democracy is the final stage? Bourgeois democracy is disintegrating. It is becoming virtually impossible at least in any significant sense politically, to describe America as a bourgeois democracy. It's a bourgeois democracy which is breaking systematically and radically with legality. Back in 2000, at the time of the disputed election, we made the point that the outcome of that election, the decision of the Supreme Court, would reveal to what extent the American ruling there existed any constituency for democracy within the American ruling elite. A government was installed through fraud. That government engaged in rampant criminality. These processes are really irreversible. And so to say what we now are faced with is a general breakdown. And again, we have to turn back to history to understand what the alternatives are. In 1911, Rosa Luxemburger wrote, the choice before mankind is socialism or barbarism. It isn't between bourgeois democracy and socialism. A thriving bourgeois democracy and socialism is between barbarism and socialism. And I think the events of the past week have made that very, very clear.
We're speaking here with David North, the author of The Unfinished 20th Century, his newly released book, which is available for purchase at Mehring.com. The interview, the discussion today, is sponsored by the World Socialist Web Site, and I'd like to encourage all those listeners participating to donate to the World Socialist Web Site, whose activity is supported by contributions from readers and listeners. David, I want to return to a question that you addressed just in your recent remarks. You asked, what are the American people, I would say, what are the workers of the world going to do in response to the terrible decay of American democracy, the putrefaction of bourgeois democracy here and around the world? And I think this raises a question of the political mobilization of the working class. A couple of our listeners are asking in particular about the conditions of the working class in the United States today versus those that existed in Russia in the early 20th century, and whether there's some sort of parallel that points a path forward for the working class today when we look back and reflect upon the present conditions in relation to the past.
Well, I think that, again, this is a very, this question has many different sides to it, but I would, from a historical standpoint, since clearly the Russia within which the Russian Revolution took place, a semi-feudal country, is very different than the United States, and so I don't think one can just describe the two as if they are co-equal there. But I think on a world scale, and in considering historical processes, there is a profound connection. And that is when we consider the link between the outbreak of World War I and the Russian Revolution. Or more specifically, or more essentially, the connection between the global contradictions of the capitalist system and the eruption of war in 1914 and revolution in 1917. As is well known, when the war broke out, the Second International collapsed. The socialist parties, infected by reformism, bureaucratized, went along with their governments, voted war credits, and in one form or another adopted a nationalist rather than internationalist position. This was opposed by the internationalists, by Lenin, by Trotsky. In reviewing the position taken by Lenin, and it is the First World War which transforms Lenin into a, you might say, world historical figure. What was so profound about his analysis, and I might add that of Trotsky, was not just that they opposed the war because it was a violation of socialist principles, but both recognized that the global contradictions that produced the war would produce social revolution. they, you might say, had an organic they understood the organic connection of these two phenomena. It wasn't just that war, in that sense, was a punishment for the crime, or that the revolution was a punishment for the crimes of war. It was certainly that in a metaphorical sense. But it was, objectively speaking, just as the war arose out of global contradictions of the capitalist system, the impossibility of reconciling the national state organization of capital with the globalization of the capitalist system, the emergence of world economy within the framework of imperialism, war, the striving of different national bourgeoisies for world hegemony, was the bourgeois solution to this contradiction. The eruption of social revolution was the solution of the working class objectively to the same set of contradictions. Now, I think the connection to the present day is the following. We have seen and we are witnessing an immense escalation of international tensions. Especially we see them in the past year. The struggle which has erupted over the fate of Ukraine, the effort of the Americans and the Germans to install a puppet regime, a sort of with fascist support in West Ukraine, the manner in which that has very rapidly, as they should have expected it would, into a direct confrontation with Russia, the relationship of that confrontation to a struggle for global hegemony, the tensions which exist between the United States and China, the immense growth of armaments, the increasing evidence of tension between the United States and Germany. Many of the fault lines are quite similar to those which existed 100 years ago. What the growing war danger tells us is that we are at a very advanced state of international crisis, of international contradictions, which must express themselves, as they did between 1914 and 1917, with an enormous acceleration of class struggle. Whatever forms that takes initially, protests, demonstrations over one or another issue, what we are going to see emerge in the next period is a revolutionary crisis. The disintegration of bourgeois democracy is just one manifestation of that. The American ruling class has demonstrated it will not shrink from any form of barbarism. The violence which it has employed, even against small demonstrations of relatively small numbers of people in different cities protesting police brutality, that is only a small taste of what is to come when they confront major struggles by the working class, which I think are on the agenda here in this country.
We have a question coming in from Bob from Iowa, and he would like to know why you have a chapter about trade unions in a book about the Russian Revolution.
Well, I think that, as I think that particular lecture notes in the beginning, I refer to two vexed problems that have confronted the socialist movement. One is the problem of nationalism. The other is the problem of trade union consciousness and trade unionism. I will admit that lecture is somewhat different from the others because it is, you might say, the most programmatic, explicitly programmatic chapter, but it is also a review, historically, of the relationship between trade unionism and socialism over a period of more than a century and a half. Now, again, this issue, in a certain sense, arose out of 1991, or at least it allowed the events of 1991 made it possible to examine that issue in a somewhat fresh character. Now, if we consider for a moment the following paradox, which I think the International Committee pointed to a number of times. The American trade unions, in particular, the AFL-CIO, dedicated itself. It relentlessly to the struggle against socialism, struggle against communism, the struggle against the Soviet Union. It formed what they call the American Institute of Free Labor Development. It represented in every sense or at least you might say, it's wrong to say every sense, but in one sense you might say that it at least saw itself and presented itself as the absolute antithesis of the Soviet bureaucracy. Significantly, though, the collapse of the Soviet bureaucracy, or the dissolution of the Soviet Union, was paralleled by the complete breakdown of the American trade union movement. It didn't gain anything from the dissolution of the USSR. Rather, it appeared to be very much part of the same process. So the question really came up, how do we understand the trade unions? What is their role? Is the future of the working class simply of a trade union form? And so what we sought to examine is the relationship between trade unions and socialism, and I think demonstrated on the basis of historical experience that trade unions have generally been hostile to socialism. The trade unions are organizations which by their very nature seek to negotiate conditions of wages, working, and so on within the framework of the capitalist system. They have as their, so to speak, historical perspective not the overthrow of capitalism, but adjustments of the conditions of life of the working class within capitalism. Now, for a long historical period, you might say that's an entirely legitimate function. However, in the absence of a socialist movement, and apart from a perspective for the conquest of power, trade unions are more and more corrupted, integrated into the capitalist system. Moreover, to the extent that the framework within which they work is not just capitalistic, but nationalistic, that they seek, under the best of circumstances, improvements for the working class within the country in which they live. That national perspective has become increasingly unviable, and so one has, particularly since 1991, and in America even earlier, one would say 1980, the PATCO strike was the real reversal of this decisively, trade unions collaborating with the national bourgeois state in the lowering of working class conditions in order to make the national capitalism more competitive. So this lecture and essay sought to explain the processes which have underlay the transformation of unions, which have abandoned any even residual connection to class struggle.
Well, David, I'd want to take up that theme in context of our own situation here. We're right outside Detroit, which just emerged from its bankruptcy procedure with a deal to slash the pensions of Detroit municipal workers and retirees, sell off city assets, kind of loot and pillage whatever was left in the public possession from the city. And just personally, having been in the former Soviet Union, I'm just visually and really kind of in the whole experience, it really strikes me that there are real certain similarities, kind of part of an international process between the bankruptcy of Detroit and what took place in the Soviet Union. After all, you had a situation in which these sort of former public assets were being sold off and stripped away. Certain very real parallels, and I think we've written perhaps before about that the conditions of workers and auto workers in Detroit were only made possible by the gains of the Russian Revolution. Could you perhaps speak about that? The international implications of the processes that are being described in this book.
Well, first of all, when you describe Detroit, it recalls, and also this is actually, Trotsky said this in relationship to an argument against syndicalists. He said, without a political leadership, without a conscious Marxist leadership, the working class is raw material for exploitation. And so this process which you've described, the selling off of assets, the systematic destruction of any form of social support for the conditions of life for the working class, all of which has been done with the full collaboration and support of the trade unions. This, of course, very much demonstrates that without the development of a revolutionary leadership of the working class, without a socialist perspective for the conquest of political power, the descent or the decay of conditions for masses of people will continue, and with very tragic consequences. That's one element of, as we speak of socialism or barbarism. You could say what you see in Detroit is one manifestation of what we see everywhere in the world. The attack on culture, the attack on education, the attack on the necessities of life. It was here in the city where a judge claimed that water was not a necessity, that there was no obligation of the city to provide water services, as they cut off thousands of families from water. Now, as the other part of your question, when you ask about the international significance of the Russian Revolution, I think it can be said that, and demonstrated empirically, that the Russian Revolution had its greatest impact on the conditions of life of the international working class beyond the borders of the Soviet Union. The major concessions won by the American working class between 1934 and 1965 would not have occurred without the Russian Revolution. It was impossible for the bourgeoisie to calculate or to determine policy domestically without taking the impact of the Russian Revolution into account, particularly in terms of the impact it had on the consciousness of the working class. The bourgeoisie was compelled to choose between either civil war or concessions, and that choice would be conditioned to a great degree by the objective state of capitalism. After 1945, internationally, at least in the major industrial countries, a policy of compromise predominated. The dissolution of the Soviet Union was seen certainly as an opportunity to restore what they would have called the status quo ante, to restore conditions to what they had been before the working class was an organized social force, before socialism became a factor in the mass consciousness and mass organization of the working class.
David, readers are asking some questions that I'd like to pose to you. Daniel from London has said the following: I think my main issue with the ICFI-SEP is its dismissiveness of the existing left. This is understandable, of course, but I think it's impossible to conceive sensibly of producing the new Marxist Party and International we need in isolation, as your comrades seem to. How do we make a positive intervention in the existing left to reach people and win them to principled Marxist politics? Or do you think we can leave them behind?
Well, I don't know what this existing left he's talking about really is. Is he speaking about an existing left which subordinates itself to the Labour Party, the various right-wing social democratic movements? We've been criticized, for example, in Germany for not involving ourselves with the Left Party which now is actively involved in promoting and supporting the revival of German militarism, the intervention of German imperialism in Kurdistan. Or the Green Party, which is become among the most pro-war parties in Germany. They talk about the existing left, but it is done without any reference to program, class interests, and political record. Everything we talk about, the ignoring of history, of moving on. An organization is defined by its program. It's defined by its historical role, by the social interests which it represents objectively. The term left has to be more precisely defined. Are they talking about the remnants of the Communist Party? Are they talking about the trade unions? No organization outside of our own has made any historical assessment of the role played by the trade unions. So the invocation of left really is used to obfuscate rather than to clarify. As far as isolation is concerned, we're not at all isolated. We produce a website which is read by thousands and thousands of people all over the world. We are continuously engaged in the developing struggles of the working class. What our critics do not like is that we oppose the subordination of the working class to the ruling trade union bureaucracies. And just to make one point very clear, we have no objection to intervening among workers who are in trade unions. Only we urge and advise the workers not to accept the dominance of the bureaucracy, that they should proceed in defiance of these right-wing organizations, these corporatist organizations, and they should create democratic factory committees so that when struggles arise, workers will have an organizational means of combating the corporations, the government, and the bureaucracies which will be functioning as political police on behalf of the state. One of the I think one of the major failings of many people who might be quite sincere about their own commitment to socialism and who really want to see a socialist movement build, they don't take the time to study the experience of Bolshevism. They don't actually study the political, theoretical struggles out of which Bolshevism, out of which the Fourth International emerged. They don't draw any lessons from the experiences of the Spanish Civil War, from the great post-war struggles, from the history of the Trotskyist movement. The International Committee itself was formed in 1953 in a split with a faction identified with Pablo and Mendel. It is necessary to examine the subsequent political evolution of those tendencies. Looking back over a period of some 61 years since the International Committee was formed, we can now see that Pabloism was a particular manifestation of the movement of the middle class to the right, breaking with socialism, and doing nothing more than employing quasi-Marxist phraseology to pursue issues of particular interest to the more affluent sections of the middle class. Just to sum up, I would urge my critic in London to study these historical experiences, to stop using the term left in such a vague and general way, but examine programs, historical positions, and in that way come to understand that it is impossible. I mean, the building of a working class movement, of a revolutionary socialist movement, is in essence freeing the working class from the political and ideological agencies of capitalism. Those who talk about the left without examining program, again, class trajectory, are using political terminology in a completely abstract way, which provides no direction for the working class. We produce the World Socialist Web Site. I think those who read the website must be struck by the political coherence of our website, by the clarity of our political line. It doesn't mean that every article is perfect. Trotsky once spoke of journalism having sturdy hips. Every day we try to make the most accurate analysis that we can of events. But our analysis is always informed by an understanding of the historical experience, historical processes that produce the day's events. And we don't have an attitude of forgive or forget. The end of the Soviet Union was in one sense a political catastrophe. The Communist Party of the Soviet Union had 40 million members. It turned out to be a big fat zero. There was not a socialist tendency to be found within it. The communist parties in one or another country rapidly transformed themselves into bourgeois parties. The Left Party in Italy. In Greece, it's one of the most virulently nationalist parties. So to approach the problem of developing a socialist movement as if it was simply possible to sort of gather everybody together who in one way calls themselves left, that is not just naive. It really is, if I can be perfectly blunt, it displays an ignorance of the history of the workers' movement.
Well, just to follow up on that point, perhaps you can sum up some of the questions that are raised here, because really, you're the one of the leaders of a political movement, and yet we spend so much time on these questions of history, on these questions of theory, on these questions of the understanding of kind of the historical period in which we live. I mean, there's sometimes Leninists are accused of kind of talking down to workers or hitting workers over the head with these abstract theoretical conceptions, when all that's really necessary is the question of leading a strike or some immediate economic gain. And why does the working class need history?
Well, I'm going to answer you, if I may be allowed, by quoting from my book, and I'm going to choose a quotation which has within it another quotation, so forgive me. But I'm talking about the, I will cite this from page 158. It's a few paragraphs, and I'll read them. Frightened by the widespread interest in Marxism and Trotskyism, the Soviet bureaucracy sought to preempt this intellectual process of historical clarification, which would tend to encourage a resurgence of socialist consciousness by accelerating its movement toward the breakup of the USSR. The manner in which the bureaucracy orchestrated the dissolution of the USSR in December 1991, the culmination of the Stalinist betrayal of the October Revolution, foreseen by Trotsky more than a half-century earlier, is a subject that remains to be examined with the necessary detail. But it is undeniable that a major factor that undermined popular resistance to the dissolution of the USSR, whose catastrophic consequences have become all too clear, was ignorance of history. The burden of decades of historical falsification could not be overcome in time for the Soviet working class to orient itself politically, uphold its independent social interests, and oppose the dissolution of the Soviet Union and the restoration of capitalism. There is a lesson in this historical tragedy. Without a thorough knowledge of the historical experience through which it has passed, the working class cannot defend even its most elementary social interests, let alone conduct a politically conscious struggle against the capitalist system. Historical consciousness is an essential component of class consciousness. The words of Rosa Luxemburg are as relevant today as they were when written in early 1915, less than a year after the outbreak of World War I, and the capitulation of the German Social Democratic Party to Prussian militarism and capitalism. She wrote, "Historical experience is the working class's only teacher. His Via Dolorosa to freedom is covered not only with unspeakable suffering, but with countless mistakes. The goal of his journey, his final liberation, depends entirely upon the proletariat, on whether it understands to learn from its own mistakes. Self-criticism, cruel, unsparing criticism that goes to the very root of the evil is life and breath for the proletarian movement. The catastrophe into which the world has thrust the socialist proletariat is an unexampled misfortune for humanity. But socialism is lost only if the international proletariat is unable to measure the depths of the catastrophe and refuses to understand the lessons that it teaches." And then I continue. The conception of history that we uphold, which assigns to the knowledge and theoretical assimilation of historical experience such a critical role in the struggle for human liberation, is hostile to all prevailing trends of bourgeois thought. The political, economic, and social decay of bourgeois society is mirrored in its intellectual degradation. In a period of social reaction, Trotsky once noted, ignorance bares its teeth. The specific form of ignorance championed today by the most skilled and cynical academic representatives of bourgeois thought, the postmodernists, is ignorance of and contempt for history. The postmodernist rejection of the validity of history and the central role assigned to it by all genuine progressive trends of social thought is inextricably linked with another element of their theoretical conceptions, the denial and explicit repudiation of objective truth as a goal of philosophical inquiry. I think that is a summation of many of the themes within this book and the spirit that motivates it.
David, I very much agree with that. I think the section that you just read really deals with these issues that we've been talking about this afternoon, the defense of historical truth, the fight for socialist consciousness in the working class, and the hostility to all those who attempt to falsify history for very nefarious political aims. I'd like to encourage all of our listeners, if they haven't already, to buy the book, which is available at Mehring.com, and to become involved in the work of the Socialist Equality Party, the fight to build an independent movement of the working class, armed with an understanding of the lessons of history. And
one last but not least point, we would really like to encourage everyone who participated and listened to this discussion to donate. If you would like to hear and see a more live media from the World Socialist website, including events such as this one, as well as live on-the-spot coverage, more video. All of this requires work, it requires significant investment, and it requires money. So we would ask you to please donate as generously as possible to the World Socialist website so we can continue doing this work. I would like to thank very much David North for being here with us today, as well as everyone throughout the world who participated, who asked questions and listened. And again, thank you very much.
Thank you very much.